I just remember thinking, why do they hate us so much? What I realized at that moment was that I'm not American. No, people don't see me as American and that I will never fit in.
Given everything that you've already experienced, but what is it that you feel like you're up against right now?
Oof, wow. And it just became clearer and clearer to me that we were being portrayed as the villain again and again and again. You can't be a filmmaker. You're Palestinian. No one will care what you have to say.
Oof.
If your political speech can get you disappeared and detained and potentially deported, then that's not just about being Palestinian anymore.
Cherien Dabis is a Palestinian-American actress, director, and writer. She made history when she became the first Palestinian-American to be nominated for an Emmy for her directing work on Only Murders in the Building, which stars Steve Martin, Martin Short, and Selena Gomez. But it's not just that. She's had several award premieres at the Sundance Film Festival, including most recently, All That's Left of You, which she directed and stars in. Her feature film debut, America, won the Critics' Prize at Cannes, and you've probably seen her co-starring in Mo on Netflix, where season 2 has recently dropped. So there's lots to get into with Cherien, especially about the significance of Palestinian representation today in light of the current political climate in the US. And she joins us now from New York. Cherien Dabis, thank you so much for taking the time to appear on Real Talk.
Oh, it's a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
No, I'm so excited for this conversation. There's lots to get into. Just looking at your CV, I mean, is it safe to say that you're a quadruple threat? I think that's probably the best label.
I've
Um,
not heard that one yet, but I suppose
I
it's
mean,
fair.
actor, writer, director, producer, and the list goes on. First Palestinian American to be nominated for an Emmy, and you've had the most screened Arab-directed film in U.S. cinema history. I could keep going, but just as if we take a step back, I mean, what is it that drew you to filmmaking in the first place?
I mean, it's a very good question. I was always interested in storytelling. From the time I was a kid, I was kind of addicted to film and television. Really, it was just, I always wanted to be in front of the screen. I always wanted to be, watching a story, kind of immersed in a story. And I would kind of point at the screen, like, I want to do that. Like, I remember thinking, like, I want to do that. Whatever that was to me, I don't know, 4-year-old pointing at the screen saying, I want to do that.
Right.
Perhaps that was the beginning of my desire to be an actor. But I think it wasn't really until I was a teenager. I was 13 years old, and I really lived through a kind of life-defining experience. And it was really that experience that made me want to become a filmmaker. But essentially, so I'll backtrack a little bit. So I was the first of my family born in the U.S. My parents had just immigrated. They're Palestinian Jordanian. And so they had just immigrated to the US, and I was born here, and I grew up mostly in a small town in Ohio. So we used to go back to Jordan and Palestine quite a bit, but my upbringing was mostly in this small town in Ohio, a town of about 10,000 people.
What's it like being a Palestinian in Ohio?
Yeah, it was tough. It was definitely tough. So I would say it was, we were one of a handful of immigrant families. So we were definitely like kind of exoticized. We were
Yeah.
othered. But for the most part, we kind of, we were accepted for the most part. My dad is a pediatrician, and so he became known as like the doctor who saved so and so's life. And, he was well respected in the community until the first Gulf War.
Right. So early 90s, we're talking.
1991, exactly. So it was 1991. I was 13. And for the most part, I just kind of wanted to blend in and be all American and just kind of fit in type of thing. But suddenly overnight, we went from being friends and neighbors to being the enemy. My dad lost a lot of his patience because people suddenly decided they wanted to boycott an Arab doctor. His name is Nazih, Nazih. So he became known as the Palestinian Nazi around town.
Oof.
And so we got death threats on a daily basis. And my favorite part was when the Secret Service came to my high school to investigate a rumor that my older sister threatened to kill the president of the United States.
Wait, what?
She was a
How did that even
she,
happen? What is
she
this?
was a threat to me, but not to the president. Um, I think the way that happened was that someone called in, like someone called a tip. She was very outspoken in her history class in high school. And she was giving an alternative perspective, the Arab perspective, the Iraqi perspective in that class. And I think that someone probably called in a tip. At least that's the theory. So it was a time, it was really kind of an insane time. Like imagine a 13-year-old kind of witnessing this. I became really obsessed with the question, why do people who have known us for a decade suddenly see us as a threat? Like what on earth are they being fed? What are they watching? What information do they have that is making them suddenly shift, like radically shift perspective and see us this way? And as I mean, it was a deeply soul-searching moment for me. I was losing friends. My parents were whispering at night about whether we needed to move.
At 13.
At 13 years old, I mean, the death threats were real. My parents were scared. We were scared. Um, so I concluded over time, as I really sat with this question of how did this happen? How did we get here? Why are people threatened by my dad? My dad who, like, he didn't own a gun. He put a baseball bat behind the front door once we started getting these death threats. My dad who saved the lives of all these little kids in town. And I really concluded, as I was watching news and television, I really concluded that the stereotypes perpetuated about us in media, film, and television were to blame, that those stereotypes were directly convincing people that we were somehow a threat and that they were incredibly dangerous. And I began to realize that nowhere were we authentically represented. And I vowed to do something about that. Like that was really the beginning of my commitment to becoming a storyteller and a filmmaker.
And even just looking back now in hindsight, how did you grapple with these questions, especially that relate to identity and your place in the world and all of that? These are quite hard and mature thoughts to be dealing with at such a young age.
Yes, they definitely were. I mentioned that prior to that moment in my life, I really just wanted to be all American and wanted to fit in. But what I realized at that moment was that I'm not American. No, people don't see me as American and that I will never fit in. And I sort of did a 180 where I suddenly was like, why are we here? Why are we living here? Why did you come here? Like asking my parents, like, why did you immigrate here? Why don't we go back? Like, most of our family's in Jordan. We go there almost every summer. Why don't we go live there? I mean, really, and I have four sisters, so there's five of us. My younger sisters were quite young at the time, but even one of my younger sisters was experiencing some discrimination in elementary school. And my older sister also was very much grappling with the same things that I was. And we really began to reject the American side of ourselves and began to identify more as Arab and, sort of became my parents' dream because we started speaking Arabic at home, which is what they had always wanted. My mom would, prior to that, was always trying to bribe us to speak Arabic. But we became much more proud of, where we come from and who we are. And I mean, we always were, but I think it was at that moment that we realized that is who we are. And that in this country, we're not going to be seen as American, even though I was born here. Um, and so, obviously, as I got older, I kind of came to accept both sides of my identity, rather than kind of swinging from one end to the other. Um, I came to really kind of appreciate that I am both.
Well, let's explore your personal story a bit more. I mean, is it true your father was a Palestinian refugee? Is that correct?
Yeah, well, he was made a refugee in 1967. Essentially, he was exiled and not able to return. He was not present in the West Bank when Israel occupied the West Bank. And so from that moment on, they refused him an ID and he was not able to return. So he ended up going to Jordan, which is where he met my mom.
And the reason why I ask this is I think there's another story that I've heard you talk about before. I think maybe when you were even younger, I think it was you were 8 years old or something, when you were trying to go to Palestine from Jordan. And then there was a
That's right.
story of you guys were being stopped and interrogated, and there's so many things that were happening in front of you. And I think it seems like from when I heard you retell this story, this was really one of the first times that you started understanding what it means to be Palestinian.
That's right. Yeah. I mean, it's my first memory of traveling to Palestine. I may have been there before the age of 8, but I think I was really young and don't remember. But at the age of 8, we traveled from Jordan to the West Bank through the Allenby border crossing, and we were held for 12 hours at the border. That my entire family, my mom, my dad, my older sister, and then my 3 younger sisters who were quite young. I mean, babies, really, like age 3 and 1, were the 2 youngest. And we were, I mean, it was horrifying, actually. At one point, the soldiers, they were picking through the contents of our suitcases and yelling at my dad, and they ordered us all to be strip searched, including my baby sisters. My dad confronted them and they sort of screamed at him. And I just remember as an 8-year-old, like thinking that they were going to kill my dad. And so 12 hours later, and this is 12 hours with, I mean, my mom had 2 babies who hadn't eaten. And it was a really stressful 2 hours. My dad actually vowed not to take us back to Palestine after that. But I remember as an 8-year-old driving into Jerusalem and sticking my head out the window and like taking in the fresh air and going, I guess this is what it means to be Palestinian. Like I've only ever heard I heard the stories. I remember, I grew up with the stories, and like kind of witnessing things that happened in my dad's family. So I kind of I knew what it was like to be Palestinian to an extent, but it was far away. It was like hearing it through, understanding it through story, as opposed to really witnessing it directly and experiencing it directly. And kind of, yeah, like witnessing the trauma of being Palestinian. That was really the first time that I witnessed that, and it definitely stayed with me. I mean, in fact, I would say that there's a scene in my current film, All That's Left of You, which is directly inspired by that experience of watching my father humiliated.
I was just going to ask you, I was like, do you look back on that memory often?
I do in a way. Like I've traveled to Palestine quite a bit. After that time when I was 8, my dad really didn't take us anymore. We would go to Jordan and then he would go to Palestine on his own. He didn't want to be humiliated again in front of us all, which I completely understand. And so it was years before I went back on my own. In fact, I had just graduated film school when I decided I need to go back to Palestine and experience it by myself. And I wanted to really develop my own relationship with the country, not a relationship that was kind of through my dad or through my family, but really through me and my work, because I knew that I wanted to make work there. And so I wrote a short film to be shot entirely there, and I went there. Um, but yeah, in the years after that experience of, seeing my dad humiliated when I was 8, like of course it stayed with me. I never got to go back to Palestine. And then when I finally did go back, I was held at the border for 12 hours. And this was a common, and I hadn't been back in so long. That was the longest I've been held. Since then I've traveled back often, and then, I've been held anywhere from 4 to 8 hours, whether it's at the border or at the airport. And every once in a while I'm just allowed in. But yeah, of course, the experience has always stayed with me because I have tremendous anxiety just traveling there, not knowing what to expect, not knowing if, especially like flying from the US, it's an exhausting trip, and then not knowing if you're going to be held for hours on end after that trip. And then also not knowing if you're going to get turned away. I have friends who were directly turned away and had to get on a flight right back home. So it's the cause of a tremendous amount of anxiety every time I want to travel there. And I know that that's the case for many Palestinians living in the diaspora. That's part of the strategy of like discouraging us from returning, even just to visit.
And the reason why I ask you is I'm curious to see how this memory kind of evolved in your mind throughout the years. Is that I'm wondering if it meant one thing when it happened at 8, and then it started kind of taking a different meaning later as you grew up. You know, maybe in your late teens or as an adult. But clearly, it did leave an impact because you say it influenced a scene in your latest film. But did it have different meanings throughout the years? Did you start looking at it back differently as you grew up?
Yeah, I think absolutely. I mean, as a kid, I didn't really know what to make of it, to be honest. I mean, as an 8-year old watching that scene unfold in front of me, I just remember thinking, why do they hate us so much? Like I was really baffled. I just didn't understand. And then, of course, that was just our way into the West Bank. You know, my dad's from a village in the north of the West Bank called Zababda, which is very close to Jenin. And we traveled all over Palestine on that trip. And I saw a lot and I understood um, as much as I could as an 8-year old. You know, I kind of understood what was happening, but I remember just really not, just kind of being left with that feeling of why do they dislike us so much? Why are they treating us this way? So of course, over the years, I've been able to put these experiences, like that type of experience, into context, and I've been able to understand, um, that I actually was watching my father humiliated. That they ordered us to be strip searched. They ordered his daughters, including his two babies, to be strip searched as a tactic of humiliation. So I've been able to kind of understand politically what it is that I saw, and that this is, not something that I experienced alone, but that this was such a collective Palestinian experience. And I think that's even more painful to think about. It's almost uh, as a kid, you don't think that, like, oh, most Palestinians, the vast majority of Palestinians are experiencing this,
Mm.
and I think it just, as you get older, you put it more and more into context and understand that this is a tactic that's used to keep us out. And unfortunately, in this case, it did work. My dad continued to return, but he didn't take us for years.
Because he didn't want you to witness that.
That's right. That it was so humiliating for him that he didn't want to go through that again, and he didn't want us to witness that. And I think also, I think my parents in general were trying to protect us. I think they were also afraid for us.
Taking that experience, Shireen, and then kind of merging it with the experience that you mentioned earlier about, post Gulf War. Taking both of these experiences and moving on, how did it kind of lead to where you are today? I mean, how did all of that influence your career?
Well, I think that I became just really obsessed with how we were being represented, if we were being represented at all in film and television, in media at large, really. I mean, I would say from the time that I really had my political awakening during the first Gulf War when I was 13, I became really obsessed with watching the media and the media's portrayals of us. And it just became clearer and clearer to me that we were being portrayed as the villain again and again and again. And I kind of couldn't believe it. Like, I think that I was so shocked, and I thought, like, why isn't anyone doing anything about this? Um, so I would say, I would go so far as to say that I became a filmmaker because of that. That I decided I needed to create authentic portrayals of us, that I needed to present another side of the story, especially as a Palestinian. Um, and I do also remember thinking, if only the world knew how we were being treated, if only the world knew, like, what, the things that I've seen traveling back. And of course, that's quite naive on some level. But I was young, I was young when I decided to become a filmmaker. And I really thought, like, I want to show the world what is happening.
You
Um,
mean by that if you show the world what happens to Palestinians, that maybe this would kind of change the status quo on the ground in a way, or
that's
influence the
right.
change? Okay.
That's right. That's right. As a teenager, that's what I thought. I thought, if I could only get some authentic portrayals of us, if I could only show our humanity, which is not at all being shown. I mean, I don't think I even thought about it as sophisticated as that as a 13-year-old. I just thought like, like, there's nothing authentic out there. There's nothing even remotely true about us out there. Um, so I then really it's why I became a filmmaker. Like, it was largely just really to represent that is why I chose this path. And I remember when I actually told my father that I wanted to be a filmmaker, he said, "You can't be a filmmaker. You're Palestinian. No one will care what you have to say."
Oof.
And I think he was, I mean, at the time, I was a little shocked hearing that,
I mean, that's heavy.
Yeah, it was very direct. It was very direct. And I remember thinking that's not true. Like, I remember railing against that sentiment. Like, my everything in my body was just like, no, you're wrong, I so wanted him and needed him to be wrong and wanted to prove that he was wrong. And again, I was young and I was naive. And I think that my dad was trying to protect me looking back. I think that he wasn't necessarily wrong.
I was going to
And
ask that. Do
that's,
you find some truths in what he said?
I absolutely find truth in what he said. I mean, there have been moments in time when I have found him to be wrong. And there have been moments in time, and I'm talking about during my filmmaking career, there have been moments in time as well where I have found him to be right. And I think that while he may have said it in a very harsh and direct manner, I really do think he was trying to protect me. So it's interesting given the moment we're in right now.
Well, that takes me to a bit of a loaded question, but as a Palestinian filmmaker today, given everything that you've already experienced, but what is it that you feel like you're up against right now?
Oof, wow. I would say that the number one thing that I feel that I'm up against. I mean, there's the larger kind of propaganda war, let's say. There's the larger propaganda and myths and military talking points. But so you could say that on a large scale, all Palestinians are up against this massive, massive story machine. Um, and but I would say, and I would say absolutely that's true, and that's a huge part of it. In addition to that, though, and I would say that this might be in some ways just as big, I think that what I'm up against is a whole lot of fear.
Fear.
A lot of fear, a lot of fear. Yeah. And I think that that's fear that is in part, it's fear that's a result of that large propaganda machine. Um,
But what is it
I
that you
think that
fear specifically?
it's not that I fear. I don't fear. I'm talking about other people's fear. I'm
Mm.
talking about other people's fear of supporting us and other
You're up
people's
against fear. Okay,
fear
I see what you mean.
of
Right, right, right.
speaking up. Exactly. Other people's fear of supporting us as we tell our stories and helping us get our stories out there. Other people's fear of, I mean, of literally, even just protesting. I mean, the punishment is so severe that even if people are sympathetic, they have a great deal of fear. So, and that I think that fear has almost come to surpass the propaganda machine at this point because there's almost more people who are fearful of supporting us, showing solidarity with us, than the people who actually still buy into the propaganda, if you know what I mean.
And how have you seen this around you, specifically in let's say Hollywood and filmmaking circles?
Well, we took my latest film to Sundance, and we had an amazing, amazing premiere there. We had multiple standing ovations and just an incredibly um, emotional screening, and continued to have emotional screenings throughout the film festival. The response was tremendous. I mean, it was so powerful. The reviews have been amazing.
The reviews are strong. Yeah.
100% on Rotten Tomatoes. And we still have distributors who are saying that they love the film and think it's beautiful, but they are fearful of the subject matter. And so that's one way in which I'm directly experiencing the fear right now. And we're seeing it. We're seeing severe punishment for showing any solidarity with Palestinians and Palestine right now.
How is this something that you take on? How is this something that you deal with in your career? Because certainly you can't detach yourself from it.
Yeah, no, I can't. I kind of, it's, you know, I'm someone who throughout my career have always tried to focus on what I can do as opposed to what I can't do or what is not happening. And so in some ways that's maybe the only reason I'm here because there's been so many uphill battles. It's been really challenging to tell these kinds of stories. And the filmmaking industry in general has just kind of continued to decline since I started making films. My first film, America, came out in 2009, and it was after a total global economic collapse. And I found myself selling a movie during a worldwide recession. And from then until now, filmmaking has only gotten more and more challenging. And films in general have continued to sell for less and less money. And we've kind of arrived at a point where the market feels like it's imploding a little, the filmmaking market. It's so kind of depressed. And a lot of smart people are coming together and rethinking it entirely. And I guess that's something that gives me hope. Like I try to focus on, okay, what can I do? Not only am I now with my third film, like looking to sell my third film in a really kind of depressed global marketplace. Um, but I'm also dealing with people's fear around this subject matter, even though I made a movie that's incredibly accessible, incredibly loving, compassionate, um, and quite possibly the most commercial version of the story that you could tell. In that it's really about family. It's really a family saga. Um, but I stay focused on what I can do. And one of the things that I can do if I need to, and we did get a couple of offers, so I can't say we don't have any offers, but we got two very small offers. So I'm focused on what potential deal I might be able to make. And I'm also focused on, in the worst case scenario, I can release the movie myself. And that is perhaps the best case scenario to empower myself and learn everything I can about distribution, because that's kind of the future of where filmmaking is going, I think, is a lot of artist to audience direct contact. And I have thought about that throughout my career. I make movies to have conversations with people and to start conversations and to create social movements. And I would love to be able to communicate directly with my audience. So I'm trying to see the opportunity in this because I think that I'm making work that is incredibly relevant to what is happening in the world right now. And I know that people want to see these kinds of films. And so I'm focusing on that rather than focusing on, the sort of the ways in which, I guess instead of focusing on the obstacles, let's say.
And if we just quickly break it down for viewers who may not know what it means to have a distribution deal, what does it mean, Cherien?
So distributors essentially will take a movie, they'll buy a movie very often at a film festival, and their job is to get it out into theaters, like to get it out into the world, essentially, to distribute it through cinemas, through streaming, through television, through all of these different kind of mediums out there. So you've got like a Sony Pictures Classics is a big mainstream distributor. You've got A24 and Neon. These are big mainstream distributors. Um, a lot of them, some of them develop films, so they're involved from the beginning stages, but most often with independent films, they come on at the very end. So they'll purchase a film out of a film festival and then they'll release it in their territory. So most of these sometimes they'll release them worldwide. Sometimes they'll buy the film, worldwide rights to a film, but sometimes they'll only buy North America, for example, or um, all of these different territories have their own groups of distributors. And for example, my film sold quite well in Europe, so I'm working with a number of different distributors throughout Europe. the Arab world, Turkey, Latin America. So we've sold well. There just seems to be a, a lot of obstacles in the North American market right now.
And I'm going to come back and revisit this. But before I move on, I think viewers will be wondering right now how your family has been looking at your filmmaking career. How has it been received internally inside your family?
I think there's a combination of a lot of pride, which is great. I think my parents are very, very proud. My sisters are incredibly proud. Um, I do think that with my parents, there is a little bit of a feeling of you work so hard. And I think that they want the reward to be bigger, for the amount of work that I put in. So I do think it's a bit mixed because, my mom will often say to me, um, don't you, like she sees me work nonstop and is just kind of like, don't you get tired? Like, don't you get discouraged? Don't you feel like this isn't worth it? Like, and I think because she feels that way for me at times, she sees the kind of the things that I'm up against and how challenging it has been. Particularly with my current film, especially given that, we were supposed to shoot the movie in Palestine and we prepped the entire film there.
And then you were evacuated. Yeah.
And yeah, exactly, had to evacuate.
Did your father ever revisit his what he told you, his little statement?
I think that my dad probably thinks, I've not talked to him about it, but it's funny that you bring that up because
Let's
now I
bring him
want to
on.
talk to him about
I got
Let's
a couple
call him right
questions.
now. Oh, I'm sure he'd have a lot to say, a lot to say. Um, I think that my dad probably thinks that that's still true. I think that he's really, really proud. Like I do think that I've had more success than he thought I would. I being nominated for an Emmy and I do think that so I think it's mixed. I think that he's really proud, but I think he also understands that or perhaps thinks that if I wasn't Palestinian, I would be more successful. In that meaning if I wasn't Palestinian and making movies about Palestinians in this industry and I was making other kinds of films that I could have more success.
I remember reading, I think it was an interview that you gave, and you said something along the lines of how you've always wondered why the world doesn't know the Palestinian origin story.
Hmm.
Can I unpack this with you?
Yeah.
First off, how do you even interpret this? What do you mean by this?
Well,
Are
it's
we talking
interesting when you
specifically history like Nekba, or are we talking more to that?
I'm really talking neckbit. Like it's been really shocking throughout my life as a Palestinian here in the United States to have the conversations that I've had and to really realize that people, like the majority of people, even to this day, have no idea. And perhaps more now, perhaps they are more aware of it now, like given the last, what we've witnessed in the last year and a half. But prior to that moment, I would venture to say that like most Americans did not know what happened to Palestinians in 1948, that they did not know that Palestinians had to be ethnically cleansed from their land in order to create a Jewish majority state. I don't think that Americans understood that that happened. So I think that the mainstream narrative, the dominant narrative was what everybody was aware of, that the state of Israel was created in 1948 and so they understand that story and that there was a war of independence. So that's kind of the dominant narrative that most people knew, but they had no idea what had to happen to Palestinians in order for that to happen. And so I would say throughout my life, like I've had to talk a lot about that and educate people on what the Nakba is and what happened to Palestinians and what continues to happen to Palestinians, sort of the ongoing Nakba. And I think that probably at this moment, people are way more aware than they've ever been, but I'm sure there's still a very large portion of the population that has never even heard of the word Nakba.
How do you center that when it comes to your own career? Is that something that influences your artistic decisions, let's say?
Well, it's a story like the story of what happened to Palestinians in 1948 is something that I always wanted to make a movie about. I always wanted to explore in cinema. Um, but I knew that I wasn't going to be able to do that out the gate. Like I knew that that's a much more complex film because it's a period piece. It's a much more expensive film. It's a much bigger film. Like I knew that I needed to take that on when the time was right, when I was ready, when I was really ready to tell that story and to do it justice because it's a big story. It's a big story and it really deserves the right story and the right filmmaker, And so I wanted to be ready. So my first two films were more personal, you could say. I really kind of stuck to what I directly knew, what my experience was as an Arab American, as the daughter of immigrants. Um, I was inspired by my family in those films, and I was looking to make work that was accessible to a mainstream audience. So tonally, I really wanted to explore drama comedy. Um, I think, when you have this identity as a Palestinian, you're so politicized from the moment that you can, that you're old enough to talk politics. You're being asked, what do you think about what's happening over there? Especially if you live in the diaspora, you live in the West. Like that's the first question that people often ask when they find out that you're Palestinian. And frankly, I found that exhausting. We didn't choose politics. Politics has been imposed on us from the moment that we became conscious of this world. And so I wanted to present stories that were not political in my first two films. Like I really purposely chose to go a route that was really about family and to really bring in comedy. I wanted I wanted to, I felt like when people think about Palestine or Palestinians, everything just gets so serious, it just feels so heavy. So I wanted to bring in some lightness. I wanted to bring in some love, some light, buoyancy. And so that was really what I aimed to do, like when I became a filmmaker. And I would say that's maybe because that's who I am. Like I'm someone who I love comedy, I love humor, I love um films about family, films about immigration, and films that like dramas that make you laugh and comedies that make you cry. Like that's sort of my sweet spot as far as even just being a viewer. Those are the movies I really gravitate towards. If something can make me laugh and cry, then that's it for me. So that's really, I think, like kind of who I am, like what my voice is as a filmmaker. And then I got to the point where after making those two films, I was ready to take on something bigger and something perhaps more challenging for me, as a subject matter, something that was much more broad sweeping and that had more breadth to it, And so I decided to tell the Nekba story. I really was like, I want to tell an intergenerational family tale, spanning decades that really traces the story of love and loss across three generations of one family. And that's what All That's Left of You is. And again, it's not overtly political. Like, this is a movie that shows you the consequences of political upheaval on people, on human beings, on families, how politics can shape a family and their relationships over time. And I think that after having the career that I had, making my first two features, working for so many years in television, I was finally ready to take on kind of a film of that scope. So that's kind of how I got there. It definitely took time.
There's a scene in All That's Left of You, which is the film we're talking about. The character that you play says, I'm here to tell you who is my son, but for you to understand, I must tell you what happened to his grandfather. And I think that
Right,
scene sets the tone, right, for basically what happened to the son, which is related to the first Intifada, and
right.
then the grandfather, which is related to the Nekba.
That's right. Wait a minute, did you see the film?
Listen, I did I pull some strings, Shireen. I pull some strings.
You pulled some strings.
No, I didn't actually see the film. I managed to get a hold of what the consensus is and what's been happening, just to make sure I prep well enough. But unfortunately, I
Well,
couldn't
you
see
were.
it in full. I couldn't see it in full, sadly.
Well, yes, there is the film does it opens with a protest during the first Intifada, and well, actually it opens with even before that. I'll rewind a bit. It opens with two teenagers chasing each other in a refugee camp, and they're just kind of running around being teenagers, running into vendors, getting into trouble, and they find themselves in the midst of a protest, and we come to learn that it's the first Intifada and they decide to join the protest. The army has invaded their refugee camp, and so they are joining the crowd of people who are trying to drive the army out of the camp. And chaos breaks out. The army starts to fire live bullets, and we see a bullet fly towards camera. And before we know whether it hit one of our characters, we flash to the face of this old woman who essentially sets up the story for us and says that she's going to tell the story of her son. But in order to tell his story, she has to start with the story of his grandfather. So that's how we flash back to 1948 and we start to tell the story of the family.
And you've called this film the experience on this film. You called it a container for grief and love.
Yeah, I worked with just some unbelievably amazing people, cast and crew on this film, and we prepped the entire film in Palestine. We traveled all over Palestine. We were planning to shoot everywhere from a refugee camp in Jericho to Nablus to Jaffa, Haifa, Ramallah. I mean, we were really all over the country. We had amassed a giant warehouse of beautifully curated props from 1948, from the 1960s and 70s and 80s. Nothing like this had ever existed in Palestine, a warehouse of these historical treasures. We had started constructing our locations, and then of course October the 7th happened, and we found ourselves uncertain about whether we'd be able to continue. My foreign crew had just arrived in Palestine like 2 days before. We had just celebrated their arrival and gone like on a tech recce where basically you take the entire crew to every location that you plan to film in and you show them what you're going to shoot. You basically show them what you're planning to shoot, like where you want to put the camera, what you're planning to do. And so, the foreign crew, of course, was totally freaked out and wanted to leave right away. And slowly we had to start evacuating people because it became clear that we weren't going to be able to continue. And, when things began and just got worse and worse and worse, and we were watching the horrors unfold in Gaza. At that point, we had evacuated. We went to Cyprus. We were all just in shock watching what was unfolding on our news feeds. And the film, we all threw ourselves into the film. Like we just, I mean, first of all, evacuating a country, none of us wanted to leave. I mean, none of us really wanted to leave. There were people who wanted to leave, but they wanted to leave because they were scared. They really wanted to stay. And a lot of people didn't want to leave at all, including me. Like leaving was horrible. I would have stayed and just shot the film there. But once I lost my crew and people like my AD and DP wanted to leave, then I could no longer make the movie. But essentially, we found ourselves making a film about what was happening as it was happening, and it was really one of the most intense experiences of my life. And I know that a lot of them would say the same thing. But the film really did become this container for us. It became a container for our grief, for our outrage, for our love, for our compassion. It became this thing that we could just completely, passionately throw ourselves into, feeling like it is something good that we can put out into the world, something good that we can create in the midst of all of this horrific destruction that we were watching.
And the idea of making a film about Palestine, but ultimately not being able to be in Palestine to film it. I mean, how did that feel?
That it was really devastating in many ways. leaving Palestine at that time and leaving my Palestinian crew behind was one of the worst things I've ever had to do. Um, I had been working with a lot of people there on the ground for months, and they were so excited to be making a historic Palestinian film like this. So to have to leave, it felt like I was abandoning them. And I wasn't sure what was going to happen. I wasn't sure if I'd be able to return. I wasn't sure if we'd be able to return to film. I kept trying to return. I tried as much as I could to bring as many crew members as I could to wherever we ended up filming, which first was Cyprus and then was Jordan and then ultimately was Greece. We shot in those three places. And we found creative ways to capture images and do some visual effects in Palestine so that we could really capture some authentic places that just couldn't be found anywhere else, like the Clock Tower Square in Jaffa, for example. Um, so we found some subversive ways to still film in Palestine without our being there. You know, we worked with people on the ground there. I directed remotely, kind of a thing. But it was really devastating to not ever be able to go back. I mean, the entire time we were filming, I stayed in touch with my crew on the ground and really was hoping that we'd be able to return to finish the film there, and we weren't able to. And it was also extremely challenging because we essentially had to find Palestine everywhere but Palestine. And I was looking for very specific locations, and we had to essentially re-prep the entire film. I mean, that's unheard of in movie making. You don't prepare to shoot a movie because it takes months and months and months. You know, you don't prepare for 5 months only to then have to stop, totally move countries, move locations, find all of your film locations all over again, and re-prep the film all over again. It was, it took many, many months more. We lost a lot of financing because of all of the preparation we did in Palestine that we could no longer use, and so we had to do it all over again. Cost us a great deal of money. So it really made everything just exponentially more challenging.
Yeah, but you were adamant to see it through. I was gonna say, like, it sounds like it would have been easier to kind of drop the production if it was that challenging.
It would have absolutely been, and I think probably some people would have done that. I knew that this story was more important than ever and that we had to keep going. And so there was no way I was going to stop.
Is it safe to say that this project is probably the closest to your heart from the ones that you've done?
Absolutely. Yeah. I would definitely say that. And in some ways, it's like, even though my previous movies were really inspired by family, and this one is as well. In many ways, it's inspired by family, by ancestors, by my ancestors and by my people. But definitely the most personal. I think also because I'm in the film and it's a tremendously emotional experience, the film. Um, and the fact that we were making it while all of this was unfolding, essentially really making a movie about what was happening as it was happening just made it wow. I mean, in some ways, the actors and I would talk about this and say it's not even like we're not acting right now. We're just channeling. It's like channeling the grief that we felt during that time into the film. It was so yeah, in that ways, it's a really deeply personal film.
Speaking of channeling, I wanna move on to Mo now, where we've seen you on screen for season one, and then most recently in season two. There's a particular scene that I want to speak to you about in Mo. You know, you're this is when you're sitting on the dock next to Farah Bsaiso, who plays Mo's mother in the show,
Hmm.
and you know exactly what I'm talking about. And I'm gonna read it. Basically, the premise for that scene is Farah is basically on her phone and she's checking updates on what's happening in the West Bank and in Palestine, and you're basically telling her to like put it down, and you tell her we owe it to them to live too. This is how they're not gonna erase us, no matter how hard they try. We're more than our pain and suffering. Now, speaking of channeling, I couldn't help but ask myself when I was watching that powerful scene how much of you you were channeling through your character Nadia through that dialogue.
Yeah, I think quite a bit. We shot Mo season 2 in the midst of my making my feature film. And so, Mo was actually Mo directed that episode 7 of season 2. And he knew that I was in Palestine when the whole, when everything started in October of 2023. And so as we were filming that scene, he came to me and he said, I want you to think about everything you went through in Palestine. I want you to think about how you had to flee. And I want you to think about, like, everything that you've been doing and everything that you've witnessed. And I remember just being like, oh, okay, you want me to go there. And so, yeah, I mean, to his credit, he kind of gave me that permission and said, this is about you right now. This is about everything that you're witnessing and everything that you're seeing. And so he really personalized it for me and kind of allowed me to go there. It was not challenging, let's just say, given everything that I had been through. So it was yeah, quite a personal scene.
And talk to me about the show in general. What was it like being on the Mo?
It was so fun. It was like really such a beautiful experience of community, I have to say. And like what a beautiful environment to be in where we all got to kind of come together and express, like, who we are, like really explore who we are as Palestinians in this country. It was so unique and so special to have that opportunity. And to do it with such really amazing people. I mean, Mo is one of the biggest hearts I've ever known. He's like such a great person, so incredibly talented, and just all heart and humor, very much the show. Like who he is very much the tone of the show. Um, I don't know that I'll ever get to have an experience like that again. Like the fact that it was the first of its kind and that we really got to come together in this way, it just felt like it felt like family, really did feel like family. It was also a really fun challenge. Mo is an incredible, like he's incredible at improvising. In fact, I remember in season 1, I showed up on set and we were shooting our first scene, which is when he comes over to Nadia's house and we meet Nadia and her husband for the first time, her white Canadian husband. And Mo just started improving during a take. And I remember just being like, oh, that's what we're doing. Like I for some reason I did not, like, no one told me that that we were improvising. And I just remember being like, what, like I'm trying to get a word in edgewise and you will not stop talking. And I'm like, finally, like Nadia just came out. Like, I gotta shut you up. You will not stop. And it was just this really funny moment in my own mind where I was like, oh, okay. Oh, okay, improv. Like, I gotta be ready for this. Like, and it made the show that much more fun because just as an actor, it really keeps you on your toes. You really have to listen when someone goes off script. You can't just, you know what I mean? Like, so you're really in it, and then you've got to kind of be on your toes and try to respond. And so it was really, from that point of view, also, it was just really fun.
And being someone who loves comedy, like you said, what was it like being in a production that portrayed Palestinians with humor instead of just trauma?
So amazing. I mean, the show is such a fantastic balance of drama and humor. And it's exactly what I love. Like I was talking earlier about that sweet spot, the shows and the films that make you both laugh and cry. Um, as someone who, with my first film did just that, made a movie that was a drama, but with humor and that made people like laugh and cry. Like it just felt so much like this is my heart too. Like this is what I love. And and who I am in the world as well. I mean, I think that I definitely have more of that in me, more of that, kind of more of that tone, like stories that are more in that tone. Though my latest, feature is much it has a little bit of humor. I won't say it's totally humorless, But it's definitely much, much heavier, more dramatic. Yeah, I just think humor is so important. And as Mo always says, like, if we're not laughing, then we're crying. So let's laugh. Like that's that's kind of the way he sees it, was that humor for him was always a tool to keep from becoming too emotional. And I think I've come to appreciate that more and more. And he's just so funny. So I've been lucky enough to work with comedians, to like really kind of get a window into that world. I didn't come from comedy. I went to film school. I always loved comedy, but I think I come from more of a dramatic background. So it was great to also, like sort of see that, get a window into that process.
And we know how well it was received publicly, but behind closed doors, especially let's say Hollywood and Western filmmaking circles, I mean, were you part of conversations that were talking about it? What was the consensus behind closed doors, let's say?
I don't know that. I mean, I do think that it was received extremely well in the industry as well. Um, but I will say it's really disappointing that it's the last season. That season two, the only way that Netflix would order season two was to say it was the second and last season. So, that's kind of a bummer. Even though the show was so well received and did so well, I haven't really personally seen that much of a focus on it from the industry point of view. Maybe Mo has. I'm sure Mo has gotten a lot of, at least I hope he's gotten a lot of attention and love. And, I'm sure he's getting people chasing him, asking him what he wants to do next. I certainly hope he is, because he deserves that.
You say that you don't have faith in political systems,
Hmm.
right? So how do you fill that vacuum for Shireen through storytelling?
I don't know if I think of it as filling a vacuum per se. I mean, I definitely feel that our political systems are beyond broken, and I'm not sure anyone really has faith anymore in them. I think that what I do have faith in, and where I kind of pin my hopes, is on people and humanity, and I think that that's where filmmaking can really make a difference. In other words, what I have hope in is the fact that in the last year and a half, people have really stood up for what is right. We've seen so many people become more and more aware of what is happening to Palestinians, and stand up and speak up and protest and all of these things. Um, and so I do feel that there is really positive change happening despite the horrific things that we're seeing kind of in the political realm. So that's where I think, I don't know, that's where I feel I play some role, is in that, is in waking people up through story, and turning that tide, continuing to turn that tide, so that we can see the humanity of a people who have suffered for way too long. That humanity has always been there, but it's been suppressed. It's been subverted, it's been replaced by, for almost a century, Hollywood has stereotyped Arabs, Muslims, and Palestinians to a horrifically dangerous degree. So I think through the kinds of movies that I make and want to continue making, and shows like Mo and other filmmakers who are telling really important stories, that we are part of turning that tide and waking people up, and hopefully also addressing that fear that I was talking about earlier, helping people to understand that, like, if you don't speak up now, you could be next. This isn't just about Palestinians. These are issues of free speech. These are really issues that go beyond even the Palestinian narrative. These are really universal issues. Everyone needs to be concerned about what's happening. So
But
yeah, I
just on
think that
these,
that's
yeah,
yeah, sorry, go
sorry,
ahead.
I didn't mean to cut you off.
That's okay.
But just on these positive gains that you outlined, I'm basically trying to get a sense of your perspective right now. Despite these positive gains, don't you think that the political climate in the West, specifically the US right now, is making it even harder to tell Palestinian stories?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the political climate right now, I think it's the worst it's ever been. I mean, it's horrifying and it's terrifying. And I do think I think it's going to have two effects. I think it's going to scare a lot of people from speaking up, and I think it's going to piss a lot of people off and get them to speak up.
Piss a lot of people off.
Oh, I think that it is actually waking some people up because now it's starting to affect them. If your political speech can get you disappeared and detained and potentially deported, then that's not just about being Palestinian anymore. And so when it comes to issues of free speech, I'm seeing a wider swath of people speak up now. Um, but I do think that there may come a point where some of those people start fearing, because again, the consequences are more severe than ever. And so I think that, yeah, I think that fear is going to take hold. I really think we're just going through everything is like a paradox of change these days. It's just like on one level, it's getting worse, and on another level, it's getting better. And in this case, in the political realm, it's just gotten so bad. Um, but it's waking people up. It's almost like the worse it gets, the more people wake up. Now, those people who woke up might not all speak up, but I'll tell you what they can do. They can buy a movie ticket, and that can be their silent form of protest because no one's going to deport you for buying a movie ticket.
So where does Cherien go from here in light of all of this?
I think that's a good question. I think that I think the next step for me is really getting this movie out into the world. So, and that's really what my next year looks like, is planning for the release of this film, not only in North America but all over the world, and really, really pushing it out in a way that I've never done before. I want everyone in the world to see this film. I want every single person in the world to see this film. Um, and that I feel tireless right now. Like, in other words, I'll do whatever, I'm going to do whatever it takes. I don't feel I have a choice. This, and it's funny because I'm like, let me think twice about what I say right now. I don't want to say too much because people haven't seen the movie yet, and it's not going to be out, you know, until later this year. So, but I guess I would say, like, if you're, I mean, I would love for people to follow the film, follow me on social media, like keep abreast of where it's showing, what film festivals it's showing in, because right now we're on the festival circuit. We're going to be, playing at festivals around the world this coming year, and then the film will start to release theatrically in the fall. Um, and I hope that people will see this movie as a potential form of protest, really going to see this movie in theaters, buying a ticket. It's really important that we support these films right now. It's incredibly, incredibly important. No Other Land was the documentary film that won Best Documentary at the Oscars this year. It did not have a North American distributor, and it was still the highest grossing documentary of the year. They did it on their own. They did a phenomenal job. It is absolutely possible. That movie's being seen all around the world. And it's really important that people go and support it because it's a really important film, but also because the only way for us to continue telling our stories is to show and to prove that we are a viable audience and that these stories can be successful at the box office. That is how we're going to get more stories. That's why, for example, it was so important that people watched Mo. It was so important that Mo was in the top 10 in Netflix's top 10 shows in the US for, I think, 12 or something straight days. That was really important because it proves that we are an audience to be taken seriously, that we deserve programming. We deserve stories about us and by us. And that's how we're going to turn around nearly a century of stereotypes that I really believe have gotten us to this moment. That century, like nearly a century of stereotypes that have dehumanized us in Hollywood and mainstream media, that has allowed for this horrific level of dehumanization of Palestinians, Arabs, and Muslims that we've been seeing. And we have to turn that around. And the best way to do that right now, I understand if people are fearful of speaking up. I get it. The punishment is severe, but you can buy a movie ticket. You can turn on Mo. There are small things that you can do that can make a difference. I mean, I hope you also speak up, by the way.
My last question, even though I really don't want this to end, I really want to keep going, but I have one more question for you. Um, young Palestinian Americans, young Palestinians, young Arabs, watching you right now as a trailblazer, and I mean young creatives.
Mhm.
What do you tell them? What do you hope that they take away from your experience, from your career, from what you're doing right now?
Well, I first want to say that I have such deep admiration for young people. Like the fact that it is young people who are out in droves on the streets. It is young people who are setting up these encampments at universities. It is young people who are putting themselves out there to fight for justice and fight for equality and do the right thing despite the attacks on them. And I have deep, deep respect for what they're doing. And I'm so sorry that this country has failed them so spectacularly. So I just want to say that. And to young people who are like young creatives, I mean, I would say we need you now more than ever. Like you do not get discouraged. Do not take no for an answer. No doesn't mean no. It just means not now or not that person or try again later. Um, I would say be yourself. Find your voice. Find your voice and do not deviate from that. And be fearless. What the world needs right now more than anything is really fearlessness, like a kind of a compassionate fearlessness. That's what I really feel. So we need more creatives, more storytellers, more people who are telling our stories and getting out there. Um, I really think that I really think that the tides are turning. When you look at human beings, um, and you look at public opinion, the tide is changing.
And we'll leave it here. On that note, Cherien Dabis, thank you so much for taking the time to come on Real Talk. I really enjoyed this conversation. And look, next time we're going to do it in person. We have to do this in person.
Inshallah.
There's got to be a follow up, inshallah.
Inshallah. Yeah, no, it'd be great actually. When the movie comes out.
I'll be first in line. You just wait.
Yeah. No, it would be great. When we get closer, perhaps when we get closer to releasing the film, which will hopefully come to the UK as well. We're talking to distributors there, so inshallah.
Thank you so much, Cherien. Thank you for taking the time.
Yeah. Thank you. It was really great. Appreciate your questions.